All right, hi, my name's Nathan Otteson. I'm a gunsmith here at Briley Manufacturing, and I have the privilege of working on some of the most beautiful and historically significant firearms that come through here. And this is a great example of that. This is a William Moore. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that are historically and artistically significant about this gun. So let's get started. Let's start from this end. If you notice, this gun has a beautiful Damascus pattern. Some people call this a thumbprint pattern. You can see the contrast of the iron or steel, depending on what makeup it had. You can see that pattern plainly right here, and that's nice. But I can hear you saying, we see a lot of Damascus guns, Nate. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that are so important here. I want you to look closely at this fore-end lug here that holds the latch. You see that's got that little hole in there, and it's got a taper on both ends of the hole. Now, I know you haven't seen that a lot, and I'll tell you why. Let me just show you the inside of the fore end here. If you look really close at that spring, you can see that it looks just like sugar tongs from your English tea set. And because that's what it looks like, we call this a sugar tong fore end. They're not absolutely uncommon, but they're fairly rare. And now, if you see one, you'll be able to say, that's a sugar tong fore end. All right, great. So let's talk about some other things here. If you look close, you'll see how there's wood all through here. That's because this is called a bar and wood gun. If you kind of look at the side here, you'll see. And what this is a holdover from the muzzleloading era. Remember, shooters and gun makers are some of the most conservative people in the world, and they don't really like change. And that's what this is. This is a way of avoiding change, because most of the people who would have bought this gun were used to a percussion or a flintlock, and they had wood from the fore end all the way back, and they didn't have that steel receiver. A lot of people were uncomfortable with the idea of that steel receiver. A lot of people thought it looked awkward. So of course, you've got the money, the gun makers say, well, we'll fix that. And they came up with this as a solution where they've laid a steel receiver inside sort of a wood shell so that it looks more like a percussion gun. Now, while you're looking at it, you'll probably also notice that the locks on this have a very wide angle this direction. It's the same thing. It's a holdover from the percussion era where people were a lot more comfortable with that angle because they needed that for room for their springs. Later, as time went by and we got better at making steels and we made better springs, you could thin that up, but this is still a holdover. That shape and size is still a holdover from that time. Another holdover that you'll see, and this is a really good way of dating your gun or finding out whether it's an earlier cartridge era or a later cartridge era, is how high and how tight these hammers are. The higher and tighter your hammers are, the earlier the guns tend to be. This gun was probably made during the American Civil War. It could have been made as late as 1870, but my guess is probably 1863. A couple of other things that you'll notice is the teardrop here on the end is really round instead of a very teardrop shape. That's another indicator of how early this gun is, because later guns will develop that teardrop, and some of them of this era will have it, but this was the era before they had ossified that shape into there's only one way to make it. And so you see some of these nice rounded ones, they're a holdover from the muzzleloading era. Now, another thing that's fantastic about this gun is it has the most beautiful and graceful engraving. And we have wonderful modern engraving today. There's some Italians who could do things that will just amaze you. But this is very much like the living plant. And part of the reason why suddenly during the Victorian era, the guns went from having a little bit of rough engraving that made the gun look good to this beautiful full coverage. And that's because there was an economic crisis in Great Britain, and a lot of the copperplate engravers lost their jobs in printing. And the gun industry said, hey, look, we won't pay you as much, but you won't starve to death. Come to work for us. And they did. They came to work for the gun makers, and they did this beautiful engraving on guns like this. And from about 1860 through about 1900, you get some of the most beautiful hand engraving that'll just take your breath away when you look at it close. A couple of other things to notice about this gun is you'll see all of the sculpting right here. Now we talk about how you can date a gun from the size of the hammers. You can also pretty much tell by how graceful these little shell shapes are. You'll see this is nice and long and graceful, and it follows sort of the Fibonacci sequence there. You got sort of a 3x5 mean. It looks very natural. When you see that, you know that that was all cut by hand with the chisel and then filed. But you also know that it was done by somebody who really understood the artistic ingredients of what he did, and he took his time. And as gun making went on, things like that would start to fall off a little bit. So later guns will still have a shell, but it won't be as long, it won't be as graceful, and so you'll know it's a later gun. This is a really nice early gun. You'll notice also this gun has beautiful streaking in its walnut. By 1900, it was very difficult to get wood like this. Not that you couldn't do it, but there were fewer and fewer guns that had this beautiful depth that guns like this would have. Finally, I want to talk just a minute about the very back end, the butt. You'll notice this has a leather-covered recoil pad. This is a very English thing. It's made out of pigskin. It's got all the hallmarks of what a good English leather-covered recoil pad should look like. But I want you to take a note about this. There's some wrinkles here, and there's some wrinkles here. He had a little trouble on both sides here. You expect to see that in a classic English leather-covered recoil pad. It shouldn't look like it just grew onto the back of the gun perfectly, because that's not what it did. This is leather. The leather doesn't have an even thickness, and so you know that this is what a classic English leather-covered pad should look like. All right, and as always, if you've got a classic English gun like this that needs service, work, or repair, you can email us at smp@briley.com or call us at 713-932-6995 or 1-800-331-5718.